All right, guys. So, in the days after Kamala Harris lost to Donald Trump, I have seen so many different breakdowns, justifications, explanations as to how this happened, why this happened, who's to blame, what should Democrats do moving forward. And I'll probably have a video either later today or tomorrow breaking down some of the worst takes that I've seen. But I want to start off here with Senator Bernard Sanders from Vermont, who I think had one of the better takes breaking down some of the structural flaws of both the United States and more specifically the Democratic Party, and even more specifically the Biden-Harris, transition and campaign from Kamala in the last couple of months here. So he starts off with this, right? And keep in mind, yesterday I posted about this on Twitter saying that I largely agree with his take, and I was getting attacked by basically everybody. I was getting attacked from the right, who think that he's a radical socialist. I was getting attacked by liberals who think that he's a toxic aspect of the Democratic, base or coalition. I was getting attacked by leftists who think he's a sellout. So let's go ahead and see what he said. This should be fun. He starts off saying, "It should come as no great surprise that a Democratic Party which has abandoned working class people would find that the working class has abandoned them. First, it was the white working class, and now it is Latino and black workers as well. While the Democratic leadership defends the status quo, the American people are angry and want change, and they're right." He says today, while the very rich are doing phenomenally well, 60% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, and we have more income and wealth inequality than ever before. Unbelievably, real inflation accounted for weekly wages for the average American worker are actually lower than they were 50 years ago. He says today, despite an explosion in technology and worker productivity, many young people will have a worse standard of living than their parents, and many of them worry that AI as well as robotics will make a bad situation even worse. Despite spending far more per capita than other countries, we remain the only wealthy nation not to guarantee healthcare to all as a human right, and we pay by far the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs. We alone among major countries cannot even guarantee paid family and medical leave. He says, despite strong opposition from a majority of Americans, we continue to spend billions funding the extremist Netanyahu government's all-out war against the Palestinian people, which has led to the horrific humanitarian disaster of mass malnutrition and the starvation of thousands of children. And then he asked the question, will the big money interests and well-paid consultants who control the Democratic Party learn any real lessons from this disastrous campaign? Will they understand the pain and political alienation that tens of millions of Americans are experiencing? Do they have any ideas as to how to take on the increasingly powerful oligarchy, which has so much economic and political power? Probably not, is his answer. So, a couple of different things here, right? Let's start off with this. Where is he indisputably correct about this? Okay, so the power of the corporate and billionaire oligarchy over both the Democratic and Republican establishments, entirely correct. I mean, in terms of his stance on, Americans broadly rejecting continued U.S. arming and funding of Israel's genocidal war on the people of Gaza, absolutely correct. In terms of, us not guaranteeing healthcare as a human right and continuing to pay, higher prices than any other major country for prescription drugs, in terms of young people feeling alienated and left behind, and that sort of the American dream is dead to them and is not going to be available to them in the same way that it was to their parents, in terms of, 60% of the country living paycheck to paycheck as we have record levels of income and wealth inequality, all of that, he's 100% correct about, right? Now, here's where I guess the controversial aspect of this comes in, at least from what I've seen from liberal pushback to this analysis. So what I've seen from liberals is basically a pushback to this first sentence. It should come as no great surprise that a Democratic Party which has abandoned working class people would find that the working class has abandoned them. And many of the liberals that I'm seeing are saying, no, Democrats didn't abandon the working class. The working class abandoned Democrats. Sort of a spin on the classic line of like, Democrats can never fail, they can only be failed. Right, which is kind of an inverse way that I look at politics. I think that it is entirely on the politician, the political party themselves to earn people's votes. I don't think that you can blame voters for not giving them their votes if they didn't feel like that candidate best represented them. But in a general sense, so let's take this first with the Biden, the Biden thing. Under Joe Biden, he has been probably the most pro-worker president in years. if not decades. At least that's what liberals claim. And I think that to some extent that is true. If you look at his National Labor Relations Board, if you look at his FTC under Lena Khan and how much they have been trying to, trust bust and things like that. If you look at him bringing back manufacturing jobs, I mean, there are certain things that you could point to in the Biden administration where he did take steps in the right direction in terms of a pro-worker direction that previous presidents before him had not. Now, if we're talking about over the last couple of decades, being the most pro-worker president in modern American history, it's really not that much of an impressive feat given the competition that you're up against, right? The bar is kind of on the floor to be the most pro-worker president that we've had in modern history. So, I think to some extent it's true, the claim that he's been more pro-worker than previous presidents, but I don't think that's really the point that Bernie is trying to make here. If you look at the broader trajectory of the Biden administration, for example, when he came in, right, and he was fighting for, during the early parts of his administration, something like Build Back Better, which was partially written by Bernie Sanders, by the way, the initial $3.5 trillion Build Back Better plan. That had a whole host of different left-wing economic proposals baked within it, right? When Biden was initially fighting for that, that was close to when he was at his most popular, right? And I showed you the graph a couple days ago that tracked his administration, and when he was talking about Build Back Better, and then you slowly see as time goes on, he starts transitioning away from that, and he starts talking about the national debt and the deficit. The trajectory of the Biden administration went from initially agreeing to try to push forward with some left-wing populist economic proposals, and then allowing all of that to either get ripped to shreds by Republicans and members of his own party like Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, and then also allowing for some of the pandemic-era programs to fall apart or to expire, right? The child tax credit being a great example of that, where initially we had a massive reduction in childhood poverty because of the child tax credit, and then they allowed it to expire. So if the trajectory of the Biden administration broadly was that you started out and you promised things like a $15 minimum wage and a public option and this massive Build Back Better plan where we were talking about paid family leave, paid medical leave, all of these different things, and you failed on huge chunks, if not a majority of that agenda, you allowed pandemic-era assistance programs to fall by the wayside, then you had this massive inflationary spiral, and instead of directly trying to confront the corporate price gougers, you basically push forward with, some rhetoric around that, but then also allowing the Fed to jack up interest rates and, housing costs exploding. The trajectory of the Biden administration is that people started to feel worse off as time went on. And I think probably the two most deciding factors or variables in why Kamala lost this election, or why people may have justified voting for Trump outside of like agreeing with his entire policy agenda, is because I think a lot of people felt as though either they were better off 4 years ago under Trump, or they felt like he's going to get prices down and maybe he'll end the wars, right? Neither of those things I think is actually true, but we're just talking about a narrative here, right? So if that's the trajectory of the Biden administration, if Kamala is intimately tied to the Biden administration because she is the vice president and because she refused to separate herself from Biden, then we shouldn't really be surprised as to why Trump won this election, as to why Trump maybe did a little bit better with working class voters this time around. I mean, at a fundamental level, I think what Bernie is saying here is that people are struggling, right? There are fundamental issues with our economy, with the corruption in our political system. Democrats essentially are still trying to run like a milquetoast neoliberal campaign in a post-neoliberal era. And that's what I think is at the core of what he's saying here. You can talk as Kamala did during her brief campaign about, a first-time home buyer tax credit, or about bringing back the child tax credit, for example. You can talk about expanding Medicare to cover at-home care or dental and vision, right? You can talk about taking on the corporate price gougers, but there wasn't a coherent narrative for the Kamala campaign in the same way that Trump had a coherent narrative, right? And I think that's one of the major flaws as to why she lost this election, right? She didn't break from Biden. She didn't break from Israel's genocide in Gaza. And she didn't have any sort of, narrative surrounding a left-wing economic populist agenda, right? So essentially what it comes down to, I guess, at the end of the day is this was a rejection of the status quo. That's why Trump won. It was a rejection of the current administration to which Kamala Harris was intimately tied to. And she had the opportunity, again, to break away from that. She chose not to. She chose to say, I wouldn't have done anything different from Joe Biden, right? So I think that's the story of this election. There are tons of other different layers that we could look at and try to break down, and I'm sure that we will over the next couple of, days and weeks and whatnot, but that's the broad story here. People are looking, as Bernie Sanders points out here, for structural change. And you can't combat fake right-wing populism with sort of neoliberal centrism. I mean, Crystal pointed this out earlier today. She spent more time in the closing hours of her campaign with people like Mark Cuban and Liz Cheney than she did with Bernie Sanders or with Sean Fain, right, the leader of the UAW. That's a big problem. And it's not just a strategic problem this campaign cycle. It shows a deeper problem within the Democratic Party apparatus as a whole. And so I'm almost left with the conclusion of like where do you guys even go from here? Because you successfully obliterated the Bernie Sanders movement 2 times back-to-back in 2016 and in 2020. Congratulations, you crushed that movement into oblivion. And what's left? What's left to move forward with? How are you going to recapture that same kind of energy, right? And so I guess that's a question that Democrats are going to have to deal with themselves.
Politic guy has the best politics. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying